Very nice. The Bank of Canada today warning in Canada that consumers face a real shock if home prices should decline precipitously because more and more of us are taking home equity loans. This is a big concern. This is exactly the kind of thing that got a lot of Americans into trouble, and they found themselves with more debt than they had equity in their house. And it's happening here, too. The amount of equity we have is falling.
There's really two issues here. The first is the issue of continuing to lever up as the value goes up, so that if you have an 80% loan to value or 90% as the value goes up, you can extract more and more cash out of the mortgage. Yeah. So that you have the reverse effect of what you would have had in the 50s or 60s when the goal was after 30 years or 35 years that you'd own your home outright and that would be part of your retirement plan, that's no longer the case. If anything, your payments will go up. Yeah. And then you get the idea of a potential death spiral if interest rates go up, and that means that people can't refi, which means that people have to sell, which means that prices go down, which means that loan to values are now higher. Right. You can see how that creates a death spiral where that's exactly what happened in the U.S. People end up underwater, and you have a true fiasco.
Absolutely. And the Bank of Canada, of course, knows very well that it at some point will have to move to raise rates. That'll catch some people off guard, and that may, in fact, be the catalyst for the home prices to fall. So some people are really, and in fact, it seems as though the growth in some of these loans are right at the margin. It's the people who can least afford it.
That's right. And people often forget that if you have these 30 and 35-year amortization periods, about 99% of every payment you're making in the first year is interest. Yeah. And so that has a very big effect. Even a quarter of a point change on your interest payment will have a very big effect in your monthly payment.
So let's move on to another headline along the same line where bankers just don't learn their lesson. Take bloggers' bank warning with several grains of salt. So this is the Globe and Mail, and they're referring to Zero Hedge, in which they blogged about Canadian banks and warned that they're on the verge of collapse because the tangible common equity ratio, which the blogger used to draw up his list, compares tangible assets, things such as loans, cash, and buildings, to common shareholders' equity. The blogger's point was that a smallish write-off of 3 or 4% of assets would wipe out shareholders. So, Max, this Globe and Mail article says that this isn't a problem in Canada. Why? Because, first of all banks are highly leveraged. So what's the big deal about Canada?
Right, that's right. They're speaking out of their morally hazarded butthole.
Yeah, but we also saw what happened to all those other highly leveraged banks, like Bear Stearns, like Lehman Brothers. Yes, they indeed were highly leveraged. Do they live today? No, they are dead. So here's another point he makes why Canadian banks won't collapse. Because he said they have intangible assets, like their brand value. And Canadian banks, he says, quote, are an oligopoly. They won't admit it, but it's true. They're pretty friendly. They don't compete too hard as U.S. banks do.
Right. They don't have to compete. It is an oligopoly. They also have an entrenched captive audience that is forced to do business with them. It is a moral hazard situation. And, of course, they are going to collapse. The reason why they haven't collapsed yet is because Canadian banks already collapsed in the early 1990s. That's when they destroyed all the competition and brought in the kleptocracy, the oligopoly in the Canadian banking system. And so to say that they're safe because pointing to the very risks and liabilities as assets gives you an idea of how you value banks these days. All of the risks and the liabilities are considered assets, and all the customers that provide the actual liquidity for the capital per something called capitalism are expendable and disposable and treated like garbage. Now, these banks are going to collapse. Why? Because the Canadian real estate market's going to collapse. Why? Because Vancouver is like Japan in 1989, Tokyo in 1989. The Alberta oil fields, the tar sands are stretched, and that Trans-Canada pipeline is going to be shut down by activists anyway. So this country's going down the tubes. And I love the fact that Business Insider, Henry Blodgett's site, has recently put forward the idea of actually having Canada and America join to create a global North American United States Union as a way to extend and pretend. Take Canada's debt and American debt, create new North American debt, similar to what we're seeing in the Eurozone. This is part of the New World Order, as some call it. Just create a global debt market, put all your local debts into it, put it out for 100 years, and pretend like it'll go away. Oh, and by the way, impose austerity measures in getting deeper and deeper every single day along the way.
Well, Max, he goes on one further, and this is like the Marie Antoinette moment, the moment where he's taunting us, because he said the Canadian banks won't collapse also because they enjoy a cozy relationship with the government. So they get effective subsidies from Ottawa in the form of Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which insures risky mortgages and buys others. So it's quite possible that if the housing market turns really ugly, the taxpayer will be forced to write a check.
Yeah, we saw this in Australia last year. Remember, Steve Keen was talking about the Australian real estate market collapse. While it was collapsing, government came in, offered subsidies, stopped the collapse for a few months, now it's collapsing again. The Canadian government will come in, again, morally hazardous because the Canadian government is in bed with the Canadian banks. They'll offer a subsidy. That'll stop the rot for a few months, and then it'll collapse anyway.
And, of course, so nothing's being done, and more debt is being loaded up onto our economies, onto the sovereign debt. I see this headline here.